Well, hi everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. So my name is Ros Gloag. I'm a biologist at the University of Sydney, and I work on honeybees and stingless bees, in particular their genetics and their behaviour. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about, I guess it's a bit of a summary, an overview of what we currently know about the swarming behaviours of Australian stingless bees, so their kind of mode of colony reproduction. And Australian stingless bees, I don't think need an introduction. We all heard Kenya's amazing talk this morning. I hope you've been to the ANBA stall during the day today to learn more about them. But they are, of course, our native social bees or highly social bees. So of all the Australian native bees that we have, around 2,000 or so species, it's just the stingless bees that live in these colonies, these advanced colonies, with a queen and tens of thousands of workers and so on. And we've got around 13 species in these two genera. They've got this tropical, subtropical distribution. And here in New South Wales, the species that we can beekeep with most readily, that is most common in New South Wales, is the beautiful Tetragonula carbonaria that makes that really distinctive spiral brood comb. And so when we're thinking about Australian stingless bees and beekeeping with Australian stingless bees, I feel like we often kind of emphasize the similarities that these bees have with honeybees, okay? Like I just said, they're both highly social bees with these queens and workers. They live in colonies. We can keep them in hives. They make honey. All these similarities with honeybees. But actually, it's important also, I think, when we're beekeeping with stingless bees, to keep in mind just how different honeybees and stingless bees are. And because I am an evolutionary biologist, I like to make little figures like this. It's kind of a family tree, in this case, of the subfamily of bees, the Apiinae, and we can look at the genetic sequences of different bees. We can make a tree showing their relationships like this, and the axis along the bottom there is millions of years, and we can infer when the last common ancestor of stingless bees and honeybees lived, and it was about 80 million years ago. And I'm just showing you this to kind of emphasize that 80 million years is a very long time. It's certainly enough time for these two lineages of social bees to have evolved off in their own direction and developed behaviours and ecologies that are really quite unique. And just to give a bit of a perspective from mammals, if we made the same kind of family tree in mammals, 80 million years is about the distance between humans and mice, okay? So we're talking about two groups of bees that really are very different in very important ways. And one of those ways is how they reproduce, their colonies reproduce. So in honeybees, of course, we see colony reproduction. We often refer to it as swarming. And what happens, under natural conditions, this is how honeybee colonies naturally reproduce, produce a bunch of queen cells. One of those new queens will inherit the old nest. The mature queen, she's going to swarm with a cohort, a subset of the workers from that nest. And from that moment, it's kind of a clean break, okay? The queen and some workers swarm away all at once, and they'll form a swarm, and they'll just continue on through the environment for however long it takes until they locate a suitable new cavity in which to build a nest. All right, so clean break, swarming with the queen. Clean break from the parent nest. What happens in stingless bees, including the Australian stingless bees, is very different. Okay, they actually have two strategies for producing a new colony. And the first of those strategies is that they find a new nest site, okay, but it has to be quite close to where they're already nesting within the flight range of the foragers, because what they will then do is slowly transfer provisions to that new nest site over a period of months. Okay, so foragers flying back and forth between the parent nest and the new nest site, building it up, adding propolis, adding the food and so on until it's ready. And at some stage, a new queen, a young queen, the resident queen of the old nest always stays there. Once she's mated, she can never fly again in stingless bees. But a new queen will be transferred or fly herself to that new site, maybe with a small group of workers, but whether or not you could call that a swarm is debatable. At some point along the way, she will mate. And then once she's installed in that new colony, again, could be a protracted period until eventually that connection between the parent and daughter nest ends and you've got two independent nests. And you might get a clue that your colony is doing this if you keep stingless bees, because you'll see exiting foragers with propolis, nest material, on their legs, like you can see in this wonderful image here by Toby Smith. So they're taking propolis out of the nest. That's a signal they're probably building another nest somewhere, somewhere nearby. And so the only kind of swarm that you will generally observe when we're talking about this first strategy of stingless bee colony reproduction will be a male swarm. Okay, so a swarm of males, a mating swarm that will establish typically close to the new nest site, but maybe close to the old nest site, just to kind of catch the queen on her, that new queen as she moves to the new nest site. And so male swarms can be large, so hundreds or thousands even of males swarming. And unlike honeybees, we heard a bit earlier today about drone congregation areas in honeybees. Okay, honeybee drones, they go to those congregation sites for a very brief and specific period of each day and will fly around just for about 45 minutes, and then they go home to get fed by their sisters. Things are very different in stingless bees. The male swarms will just persist all day and often for days and days or even weeks at a time. Just the males flying lazily round and round in circles. And stingless bee males, unlike honeybee drones, are actually really quite independent little fellows, okay? So they do not contribute any work to the colony. They're similar to honeybee males in that respect. But when they're mature, they will leave the colony in which they are born and they will never come home. Instead, they just move through the landscape. They'll find their own food at flowers and they'll keep going until somehow they locate a colony that has a virgin queen ready to mate. So either because the colony is replacing its queen or you've got one of these newly established colonies. And then they'll aggregate in these mass swarms like this. And the queen will just move from the colony into the swarm, mate once, back in the colony, and that's all she ever does, the virgin queen. And maybe, again, if you keep stingless bees or just have keen eyes, you might see male tetragonula roosting all together at night, these little kind of like bachelor sticks where they all line up together. Sometimes, again, hundreds of them roosting, ready for a busy day of flying around in circles again the next day. And if you see a big swarm of bees in front of your stingless bee colony and you think, are they males? I don't know. You are not alone, okay? It's not easy to tell the difference in Australian stingless bees between males and workers. They're the same size. They're both black, okay, with that kind of silvery fluff if you get them under a microscope. what I find is the best cue if you're curious to know whether the bees swarming in front of your hive are males or workers is to try and grab one in your hand. You can do this with stingless bees, of course. Even the workers are not going to harm you. And then have a look closely at the mandibles, okay? So I'm showing you here in this image a worker and a male, and I hope what stands out is that the worker has got some serious jaws on her, okay? She could defend the colony. She can't sting, but she's good at biting, loves to bite, in fact. The male, very tiny little jaws, couldn't harm anything. So you pick them up, and if you get your eye in after a while, looking at those jaws, is she trying to bite you? Is she just kind of, is he not? He's a male. Now, stingless bees have a second strategy for producing a new colony. And maybe you were thinking, oh, that process of months long of going back and forth provisioning a new nest sounds like really hard work. Well, you're right. And it may be no surprise, therefore, that the stingless bee's second strategy is a shortcut, okay? Instead of finding a new empty cavity and provisioning it slowly from the parent nest, they will find an occupied cavity that already has a stingless bee colony in it, and they'll try to usurp that colony. And if successful, they will then install their own queen, okay? They'll kill the existing queen in that colony, they'll install their own queen, and then all of the brood that subsequently hatches in that stolen colony will just kind of unwittingly begin working for that new queen. So they really kind of hijack not only all the rich resources in the nest that they steal, but also that unhatched worker force, which becomes a worker force for the new monarchy. So I'm showing you here a fantastic video from YouTube. It's one of those fascinating behaviours that's surprisingly hard to get a good video of because, of course, our little bees are so small. But what will happen when there's an attempted usurpation, nest takeover, is that often the defending colony, unless it's very weak, is going to put up some defences. And what they do is that every worker that can fly within that nest exits and forms a huge swarm directly in front of the colony. I refer to it as their air force, and you can see it in this video. They're not flying in a lazy way like males, they're flying in a frantic way. There'll be workers going in and out of the colony, but that huge cloud of workers, okay, every worker that is able-bodied or able-winged out of the colony in the air means that attackers must kind of fly through that swarm in order to access the nest that they're trying to take over. And as a result, you see these bees colliding in midair, falling to the ground, and just kind of wrestling each other to the death. And you can get these carpets of dead bees when you've got a very serious fight, usually two bees locked together in this kind of death wrestle. Again, stingless bees, they don't have a sting, there's no quick death in these things. What they do is just kind of wrestle each other until usually both die. So it's a costly exercise for the defending colony as well. They're going to lose a lot of workers, but the risk is high, of course. The alternative is that they lose their entire nest. And how do we know when we see these big fights and these carpets of dead bees that that's what's happening, that it is this kind of nest takeover attempt and not, for example, some sort of civil war within the bees of the colony or some sort of community-level fight between many, many different colonies? Well, it's because we've looked at those dead bees that are generated by these fights, and we can do some genetic analyses of those and compare them to the closest colony, the colony that appears to be under attack. We'll call that the defending colony. And we see that most of the time, this is just a plot which is showing in black, the proportion of dead workers after one of these fights, for 8 different fights, that are a genetic match for that defending colony in black and a genetic match for the attacking colony, or for what we assume to be the attacking colony, in white. And I guess the thing to take away here is that there really are usually 2 colonies involved, the one that's under attack and one other one. And that attacking colony in this study, it was never a nearby, it was never a colony that was in the same bee yard or one that we could find or sample. It was coming from further away. So that's one thing to note. And you will see that there are some little grey bars in some of these instances. Those were workers from other colonies, but which were likely just they were either innocent bystanders from the same bee yard that were kind of getting caught up in the fight, or possibly there were other colonies in the neighbourhood who thought, I might have a go and see if we can sneak our queen in amongst all this chaos. More recently, and I should have added there as well actually, there's also been studies demonstrating that you can sample those bees during the fight and then sample 6 months later using those same genetic tests and demonstrate in that way that yes, sometimes the attackers are successful because 6 months later the genotype of the colony will match the attacking colony. So we know that sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not when we have these fights. We were interested also in understanding whether this nest takeover behaviour was something that is very common also in wild nests, because one nagging doubt I've had in my head for a long time is, is there something about the way we keep the bees in hives that is kind of exaggerating their fighting tendencies, because these sort of fighting swarms are common, and that actually in the wild they tend not to do that. And so we tried, that would be interesting if true, because then maybe there's some things we can do to change the way we keep the bees in hives to kind of reduce their fighting. And the way we asked that question was to look at this population of wild nests, which was in Brisbane. We searched this forest, Toohey Forest, in Brisbane. We found 58 nests that were just living in nest cavities, tree cavities. And we then went back, we sampled workers from that nest, and then went back after 1 year, after 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years, again sampling each time, and then could infer from the genetics of those workers what had happened to the queens of those colonies. Had it been a natural progression of a daughter queen taking over from her mother, or had it been one of these nest takeovers, in which case we could see that they would be genetically different. And this is kind of like a map of what we saw in the forest to start with, and because in this part of Queensland there are 2 species, Tetragonula carbonaria and Hawkingsi, that's why you can see 2 coloured dots there. And this is just a very brief summary of what we found, but basically at most of the colonies, so the majority, yes, there was a natural queen succession, okay? So daughter inheriting the nest from her mother, exactly, that's what we would expect. But that orange piece of pie there were the colonies where we could see there had been a takeover event. They were no longer the same maternal lineage as they were from the first sampling point, and in some cases they had switched species from Carbonaria to Hawkingsi. So I think the takeaway there is that these bees, this is just part of their natural behaviour. I don't think we can do anything to stop them fighting. That's just how they roll. That other piece of pie, if you're wondering, those were the colonies that at the end of 5 years had died in this natural population. And I was quite interested by that, and I'm showing it here now just because I think for those of us who keep stingless bees, sometimes you'll have a colony that just goes on and on and on forever. I spoke to someone earlier today who'd had the same colony for 20 years. Okay, so they can be really long-lived, but in natural populations, they're often not that long-lived, okay? So, in a natural population, it's quite dynamic. The location of natural nests is always moving. They're always making a new nest somewhere else, and the old ones are dying. So don't feel too bad when your colonies die. In the wild, they probably only live on average about 5 years. Okay, I'm almost at time, but I wanted to very briefly, just one slide on the topic of mites, because obviously there's lots of talk about mites at the moment, and I hope all of you know that stingless bees are not affected by any of the mites that reproduce in honeybees, okay? So all the mites that honeybees have, Varroa, Tropicolaps, etc., are very tightly connected to the honeybee life cycle, and they do not infect stingless bees. But last year we realised that Tetragonula, at least, do have their own brood cell mite. Okay, you can see it walking around in the cells there. It was described by our colleague at Queensland Museum. It's called Proctotidaeus. And these tiny mites also live inside the brood cells of Tetragonula. Okay, and you can see them walking around there in cells that I have ripped open. If you're wondering what do they do, are they bad, are they good, we don't know yet. We are investigating. So it might be that they in fact feed on fungi inside the cells of Tetragonula, in which case they might be beneficial or at least harmless, okay? So think of like a cleaner wrasse on a fish, just cleaning up bits of stuff that the fish doesn't want. Maybe that's what these mites are doing. Or they might be feeding on the bees themselves, which would of course be bad, or they might be doing a bit of both, depending on the mite load or other environmental conditions. So at the moment, we think they're not that bad because we're finding really high mite loads even in colonies that are very healthy, but it's an active area of research. And that's all I want to say. Thanks.